So let me start with the supplement side, and let's start with the basics, the calcium and the vitamin D. You see, when you go to your doctor and they tell you that you have osteoporosis and they talk to you about likely the drug recommendations that they're going to have, they're also likely going to say, and you should make sure that you're taking calcium, 1,200 milligrams a day, and vitamin D. And a lot of times they don't say how much vitamin D. This is the feedback I get. And then they're also going to likely tell you to do some weight bearing exercise. I talked about exercise in the last one, so I'm going to skip that one today. But let's talk about the calcium vitamin D thing. So I understand why it makes sense to take calcium and vitamin D. But when you look at the literature around this, calcium alone doesn't seem to do a lot for bones. And the reason why that's true for people with osteoporosis is that they're generally not deficient in calcium. They might be, but usually this is not a calcium deficiency problem in the United States, at least. And so the recommendation to take 1,200 milligrams of calcium, if you're over the age of 65, is because we need to have the building blocks to build bone. And bones, primarily from a mineral perspective, are made of calcium. So that's true. I get it. It's not wrong, for sure. But if you have people track their food intake like we do, especially if they're consuming dairy, and potentially even if they're not, they're actually getting adequate calcium in their diet, especially if they're focusing on it. So then taking an additional 1,200 milligrams, which is what a lot of people will think they heard, take an additional 1,200 milligrams of calcium, that's actually a lot of calcium for your body to process, especially when consumed at a single time point or even in two 600 milligram time points. And so it can result in some potential negatives. Many of you have probably heard of calcium supplementation being associated with an increased risk of heart disease, an increased risk of heart attack specifically. And those studies are real. Those studies are out there. Now, fortunately, you can just add a little bit of vitamin D and that risk seems to go away. But one of the things that stands out to me is that if you look at some of the studies on calcium supplementation, you do see a spike in calcium in blood, and that's concerning. So when you get a spike in calcium levels in blood, potentially bad things could happen. Now, your body's pretty good at controlling calcium levels in blood because calcium is a really important mineral, not just for bones, but elsewhere as well. And so while that spike is short-lived, your body has to put it somewhere. And if your body doesn't have the tools or the building blocks to put it in bone, it might put it somewhere else. And this is the concern around calcium. Plus, many people, again, consuming this much in supplementation just simply don't need it. So when we looked at the research on this and the guidelines, what we figured out is that if people are consuming close to that 1,000, 1,200 milligrams, they probably don't need any calcium supplementation at all. Or maybe they just need a little bit. And then when you look at different forms of calcium, we start looking at the whole market, you realize that there's the synthetic forms, the carbonate and the citrate, but then there's also the whole food forms. So there's forms that are coming from algae. There's forms that are coming from ground up bone that could potentially contain other things like the proteins and the other minerals, the hydroxyapatite that's in bone. So then we have to start asking ourselves, like, which one should I be taking? When you look at the research and you realize that if you consume it from whole foods, meaning especially from dairy, but any whole food form of calcium, this is true. If you consume it from whole foods, that intake seems to actually be inversely related to heart attack, meaning the more you consume, the less likely you are to have a heart attack. So I tend to bias towards these whole food forms of calcium, again, ground up bones in the right form and from the right source, or from algae, again, from the right source, formulated the right way. So there's a lot of different products there. I'm not going to name any brands today, but utilizing these whole food forms of calcium, I think has potential benefit. Now, I'll be the first to say that there are not large scale studies on this. But again, most of my patients, most of our community members are actually consuming most of their calcium through diet. And then they're just supplementing a little bit on top of that. And that's actually a good segue into this whole concept around supplementation in general. I already said that most of you who are listening to this, if you have osteoporosis, don't want to take the drugs or don't want to stay on the drugs. But a lot of you want to take supplements. The question is, how much of that supplement should you be taking and which of the myriad options, the numerous options that are out there, should you actually consider? So that's a good segue actually to talk about the supplement industry in general, because the supplement industry is a wild space. Whereas the drugs are very regulated, and you've got the FDA and you have all these different organizations, for better or for worse, trying to create something that is very, very much the same thing, the same drug, the same dose, quality, et cetera, safety. In the supplement space, you have very little oversight. So there are supplement companies And then there are companies who pretend to be supplement companies who are selling things that have absolutely nothing to do with what the label says. There's products actually out there. If you go on certain online retailers, you can find products that are completely fake. The label's fake, the product's fake. There's nothing in there, or what's in there is actually potentially dangerous. The supplement industry is wild and unregulated. So you really have to get your supplements from a good source. And again, I'm not going to name brands today, but there are online dispensaries that you might hear me talk about elsewhere. There are companies that are helping to regulate this that are only utilizing supplements from quality manufacturers that use third-party testing to verify the thing is in the thing that they're selling, and then companies that are helping to store that in the right way to move product around so that it's not old, that it's not expired, and then ship it the right way. All of those things matter when it comes to supplements. So then let's get away from calcium. So what else do you need outside of calcium? Well, I already said that you might not even need that much calcium, but you need minerals. We need all of the minerals. It's not just calcium. We actually need all the minerals. We need the magnesium. We need potassium. We need boron, which is a weird kind of mineral. You need all the potential vitamins that you might be missing in diet. And this is why it's important to track your diet. But fat soluble vitamins in general are going to be harder to get through diet. So that's vitamin D. And I see lots of people now taking huge doses of D. So I'm going to come back to D. But that also means K, it means A, it means E. Those fat soluble vitamins might be difficult to get through diet, even if you're consuming an optimal diet. So let's go back to D. So vitamin D, really popular. It's called vitamin D, but really it's a hormone. It's a pro-hormone. And you can absolutely take too much of this. So this is one that we're absolutely testing because how much sun you get, what your genetics are like, what your diet is like is going to dictate if you even need vitamin D. Most of us do. So then how much do you need? And this is going to be extremely variable based off of genetics, based off your ability to absorb, to assimilate, how much you are actually utilizing versus expending. So how much you need is extremely variable. This is why we should be testing. So I'm not even going to talk about a dose. I'm going to talk about a recommendation there. The A and the E, a little bit harder to make recommendations around. But my recommendation is to look at how much you're getting through diet and then potentially adding some of these things in. Same thing with vitamin K. Vitamin K is pretty confusing. There's a lot of concern around blood clot with K, but the truth is, from a supplement perspective, vitamin K2 has never had a study that showed that it increases the risk of blood clot. K1's a slightly different situation, but even then, as long as someone isn't on a specific type of blood thinner, then it isn't an issue. So K2 is really important to work along with vitamin D to help get the minerals where they're supposed to go, especially calcium. So we really need all of those things. And I'll just dig in a little bit more on the vitamin K. So K2 gets even more confusing because there's two subtypes. There's actually several, but there's two that you'll hear about. There's K2 is MK4 and K2 is MK7. MK4 is the one that has more research behind it. So there's a lot of advocates for MK4, but the research is on this very highly supraphysiologic dose. So it's a dose that is many, many times larger than what you could ever get through diet. And that might be okay in the short term. It might be okay in the long term, but we just don't have any long-term data. And then there's also another form, MK7. And this form is going to have a longer half-life, easier to dose, but there's less research on how much we should actually be taking. So we sort of split the difference here, and we're kind of recommending to use all the different forms of vitamin K, some through diet, some through supplementation. And then we get into some of these quote unquote specialty supplements. There's a lot of interesting products out there on the market. If there's a product out there, though, that doesn't have specific evidence for that product for this indication, I would tend to shy away from that for my patients. Because there's a lot of products that are out there that are making claims around bone health that just don't have evidence to support it. There's plenty of products that have evidence, maybe not that for that specific company, but for that ingredient that might be reasonable under certain circumstances. So some examples of that might be like lactoferrin, for example, is an interesting compound. It's a protein found in raw dairy that gets destroyed when you pasteurize dairy, but it has been taken out of raw dairy and it can be found in supplementation and independently can increase bone density in studies. So that's kind of cool. Other things like there's an herb called French maritime pine bark extract, couple different versions of this, but each of them have been studied in bone health and have been found to be beneficial for bone health. So this is kind of cool where we have these things that are reasonably well studied as an ingredient. But then there's products out there, and I'm not going to name any names because they'll send me nasty letters, but they make claims on their website that it is good for bone, but then when you actually look up the ingredient is not even the ingredient that's in the thing. Or it's something like they'll do research on one form of it that's, potentially used like surgically as an example, would literally put on bone and then they make an oral version of it. And when I see products like this that are marketed, I always ask the question, well, where's the research? Show me the research and maybe we can get behind this because maybe it would be beneficial. And oftentimes when I reach out to the companies, they don't get back to me. Or if they do get back to me, they send me some research, but it is inadequate from my perspective. And so this is a big challenge in the supplement space because there's a lot of money to be made in supplements. But generally what we do in our program, we're talking about the details, but what we were doing with our patients and as we build out these programs, we realized that if we just focus on the fundamentals, if we just focus on the core things, generally we're going to see things improve because so many people are missing some of the big levers that we can pull. We don't necessarily need to get fancy. We don't need to get to some of these exotic things. We just need to focus on the core and do that consistently. And then we do see improvement. What I tell people who are not our patients is to make sure that you're getting products from someone who is making specific recommendations for you based off of biomarkers. So that would be blood or some kind of functional testing, or based off of your genetics, or based off of an examination of your diet and understanding what you're missing. Supplements truly should be supplemental to all the foundation. And then getting them from a source that is either a company directly from the company that's doing third-party testing and showing you what that third-party testing is, or kind of an intermediate. And there are some online intermediates that a lot of doctors will use. We use sometimes too, that is going to store, ship appropriately, and get you the product that you are actually looking to get in a safe way. And so those things are out there, but this is why working with someone who can make these recommendations and has some of these online dispensary options is going to be really valuable rather than just using the big box store, the Costco, the Amazon, the whatever, because in those spaces, there's a lot less control.